man sits alone in a small cell, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the walls close enough to feel like they are breathing. Mike Tyson, once the youngest heavyweight champion in history, is now just another number inside a correctional facility in Indiana. There are no cameras here, no roaring crowds, no belts to defend. Only silence and repetition. What makes this moment disturbing is not the fall itself, but what happens inside it. Tyson had spent years building an identity around dominance, aggression, and invincibility. Inside prison, that identity no longer functions. There are no fights to win, no opponents to intimidate. And yet, his mind continues to operate as if that identity still matters. He trains. He shadowboxes in empty air. He repeats patterns that no longer fit the world he is in. This is where something subtle begins to surface. When a person loses the environment that once reinforced who they were, identity does not disappear immediately. It lingers like an outdated operating system still running in the background, consuming energy while producing nothing useful. Tyson later described prison as a place where he was forced to confront not just his actions, but the structure of who he believed himself to be. The uncomfortable truth is that change does not fail because people lack information. It fails because something inside resists abandoning a familiar identity, even when that identity is no longer functional. The mind prefers a known form of suffering over an unknown version of growth. And when that resistance becomes invisible, it quietly governs every attempt to change. Not through logic, but through identity preservation. The same man walks through the prison yard weeks later. The sky above is pale, indifferent. The other inmates move around him in predictable patterns, but something has shifted in how he experiences them. He is still physically strong, still recognized, still carrying the memory of who he used to be. But that version of him no longer has a stage to perform on. In this stripped environment, identity begins to behave differently. Without external validation, the habits that once felt natural start to feel excessive, even unnecessary. Every movement becomes a question. Is this still me, or just a habit that survived me? Tyson's time inside became a forced confrontation with something most people never notice. Identity is not a single decision we make. It is a system continuously reinforced by surroundings, reactions, and repetition. Remove the reinforcement, and the system begins to destabilize. This destabilization is not comfortable. It creates tension between who a person believes they are and what their environment allows them to be. In that gap, many people do not change. They fracture internally. They keep performing outdated versions of themselves because abandoning them feels like disappearance. And yet, something else also begins to emerge in that same space. The possibility that identity is not fixed at all but maintained. What follows is not a story about prison. It is about what happens when the invisible scaffolding that holds a sense of self begins to weaken, and the mind fights to preserve it even when it no longer serves survival. Most people assume change is a matter of willpower. Add discipline, remove distractions, force new routines. But what remains hidden is that resistance is often not about effort, but about identity protection. When a person tries to change a habit, something deeper is triggered than behavior adjustment. The brain evaluates threat, not physical threat, but existential continuity. If I stop doing this, do I still remain the same person? This is why certain changes feel strangely uncomfortable even when they are objectively positive. It is not the task itself that is difficult. It is the silent negotiation between old identity and emerging possibility. In Tyson's case, and in countless human stories like it, environments act as silent architects of identity. They reward certain behaviors and make others unnecessary. Remove those structures and the brain does not immediately adapt. It resists because adaptation requires abandoning familiarity. And this is where the contradiction becomes visible. People often desire change and simultaneously defend the very structure that prevents it. Not out of logic, but out of psychological preservation. What begins to matter is not motivation, but recognition. Recognizing that resistance is not evidence of failure, but evidence of a system trying to keep coherence intact. And once that is understood, a different question begins to form. One that does not ask how to force change, but what kind of identity is currently being protected without awareness. There is a moment most people never consciously notice, when effort stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like internal friction. Not because the goal is wrong, but because the identity behind it has not been updated. At that point, persistence alone is not enough. The system resists not because it cannot change, but because change feels like loss of self-consistency. And this creates a paradox that quietly governs human behavior. People are capable of imagining a different life, even desiring it intensely, while simultaneously acting in ways that preserve the version of themselves they are trying to escape. So the real question is no longer about discipline or motivation. It becomes something more uncomfortable. If identity is what the mind is protecting, then what happens when the environment stops reinforcing who you think you are? And more importantly, if your current resistance is not a flaw, but a form of protection, what exactly is being protected inside you that refuses to let go, even when you no longer recognize it as yours? In the summer of 1971, at Stanford University, a basement was transformed into something that looked less like a psychology department and more like a controlled simulation of confinement. The walls were painted, doors reinforced, corridors redesigned. Cameras were installed in hidden corners. What was about to unfold was not a study of intelligence or memory, but of behavior under assigned identity. 24 young men, carefully screened for psychological stability, were selected to participate. They were randomly assigned roles. Some became prisoners, others guards. There was no prior training for cruelty, no instruction on dominance. Only minimal guidelines. Maintain order, do not use physical violence. At first, everything resembled performance. Laughter echoed through the corridors. The guards adjusted uniforms, sunglasses, batons as if trying on costumes. The prisoners played along, uncertain, even amused by the artificial structure they had entered. But something began to shift faster than anyone expected. The assignment of roles did not remain symbolic for long. The environment itself started reinforcing behavior. The guards began to experiment with control, small commands, structured routines, imposed rules. The prisoners, in response, began to adjust, comply, resist, then comply again. What emerged was not planned. It was not scripted. It was the gradual absorption of identity into role. Within days, the distinction between simulation and reality started to blur. The guards no longer behaved as participants acting in a study. They behaved as if authority had been granted to them by something real. The prisoners, in turn, began to internalize submission not as a temporary condition, but as a position within a system that felt increasingly inescapable. The experiment was designed to last 2 weeks. It did not survive even that long without breaking something deeper than procedure. By the second day, the basement no longer felt like an experiment to those inside it. It began to feel like a functioning system with its own rules, even if those rules had no external justification. The guards started organizing shifts not because they were instructed to, but because structure reinforced their sense of control. Small decisions accumulated into patterns: who could speak, when to move, how to stand. The prisoners, meanwhile, began to lose the early distance between themselves and their assigned roles. What started as compliance for convenience slowly became behavioral default. Requests for basic needs became negotiations. Resistance became rare, and when it appeared, it was met with escalating correction. Not always physical, but psychological. Isolation, humiliation, deprivation of autonomy. What is critical in this phase is not aggression itself, but the ease with which it emerged. No one had been instructed to become harsh. No one had been trained to submit. Yet both patterns developed as if they were latent, waiting for environmental permission to activate. The most unsettling observation was not that individuals changed, but that they changed without feeling they were changing. Identity adjusted incrementally, justified internally at every step. Each action made sense in isolation. It was only when viewed as a whole that the transformation became visible. At some point, the roles stopped being something people were playing and started becoming something they were maintaining. And once identity becomes maintenance rather than choice, reversal requires more than awareness. It requires dismantling the system that keeps reinforcing it. The question was no longer what the participants would do next. It was what would happen when the structure itself began to define reality more strongly than the people inside it. As days continued, the boundary between observation and participation collapsed almost completely. The presence of cameras, initially a reminder that this was temporary, became irrelevant. Behavior no longer seemed performed for an outside observer. It became self-sustaining. The guards refined their methods without instruction. They discovered that control did not require force to be effective. It required consistency. Repetition created predictability, and predictability created compliance. Even small gestures, tone of voice, timing of commands, spatial positioning began to carry authority. The prisoners adapted in a different direction. Emotional withdrawal increased. Requests were minimized. Identity contracted around survival within the imposed structure. Some began to internalize the idea that their role was not assigned arbitrarily, but somehow deserved or fixed. What made the situation increasingly unstable was not a single extreme act, but the normalization of incremental shifts. Each step was small enough to remain rational. Together, they formed a complete transformation of social reality inside the basement. Eventually, the experiment required intervention. External observers recognized that what was being studied had stopped being theoretical. The system had generated real psychological consequences that exceeded its original boundaries. And this is where the central tension becomes unavoidable. If ordinary individuals can adopt entirely new identities simply through environmental assignment and reinforcement, then the line between who we are and what we are placed into becomes far thinner than most people are willing to accept. Because what happened there was not an exception. It was a demonstration of how quickly identity can reorganize itself when the world stops treating it as optional. But what nobody tells you is that this was just the surface. What happens inside the mind when all external support disappears is something far more disturbing. In a controlled laboratory at Yale University in the early 1960s, an ordinary-looking setup was prepared that carried an extraordinary psychological weight. A man in a lab coat, calm and composed, stood beside a machine marked with voltage levels. Beyond a wall, unseen, another person was seated, believed to be receiving electric shocks as part of a learning experiment. The participant in the room was told he was assisting in a study on memory and punishment. His role was simple: deliver shocks of increasing intensity whenever the unseen learner made mistakes. The shocks were not real, but the participant did not know that. Each switch he pressed felt like a real escalation of harm. At first, the task seemed manageable. Low voltage levels created little hesitation. But as the numbers increased, something shifted in the room. The learner's scripted responses, complaints, protests, and eventually silence, began to create tension that could not be ignored. What made the situation powerful was not the machine, but the authority figure beside it. The experimenter, calm and precise, would simply say phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue." No sreds, no egrestion. Only institutional certainty. Inside the participant, a conflict began to form. On one side, personal morality, the intuitive sense that continuing might cause harm. On the other, external authority, the structure of science, legitimacy, obedience to instruction. Each decision became heavier than the last. The act of pressing a switch was no longer mechanical. It became a negotiation between identity and command. And as the voltage levels rose, so did the internal fragmentation between what felt right and what was being required. As the procedure continued, the participants' internal state often became visibly unstable. Hesitation increased. Some would turn toward the experimenter, seeking permission to stop. Others would laugh nervously, a fragile attempt to reduce tension that no longer felt manageable. The experimenter's responses remained consistent. No physical force, only structured authority statements that redirected responsibility away from the participant. Please continue. The experiment requires that you go on. You have no other choice, you must continue. What emerges here is not coercion in the traditional sense, but a transfer of responsibility. The participant is not being forced by violence, but by institutional framing. The authority becomes the psychological anchor that defines what is acceptable, even when it conflicts with personal ethics. Many participants experienced acute distress, sweating, trembling, verbal protests, yet a significant number continued despite expressing discomfort. The behavior did not align with what they believed they would do beforehand. This is where the conflict becomes most revealing. Moral identity is not always strong enough to override structured authority when that authority is perceived as legitimate and impersonal. The machine, the lab coat, the controlled environment, all of it worked together to create a system where obedience felt like the default path forward. And as the levels increased, so did the psychological cost of maintaining compliance. Each action deepened the gap between self-concept and behavior. What had begun as participation in an experiment was becoming something else entirely. A demonstration of how fragile moral autonomy can become under structured instruction. Some participants reached a point where the conflict between instruction and conscience became unbearable. They questioned the setup, expressed concern, or attempted to disengage entirely. Yet even in those moments, the structure of authority remained intact, guiding the continuation of behavior through its institutional framing. What makes this phenomenon historically significant is not the extreme behavior alone, but its ordinariness. These were not individuals predisposed to cruelty. They were ordinary people placed in a structured environment where authority was clearly defined and socially validated. The findings revealed a disturbing pattern. When personal responsibility is diffused into an authority system, individuals may act in ways that contradict their own moral self-concept without experiencing themselves as the origin of those actions. This creates a split that is difficult to perceive in real time. One part of the mind continues to identify as ethical, responsible, and autonomous. Another part executes actions that align with external instruction rather than internal values. The experiment did not rely on force. It relied on structure, legitimacy, and incremental escalation. Each step was small enough to justify. Together, they produced outcomes that felt unthinkable at the start. And this is where the deeper implication begins to surface. If moral behavior can be overridden not by changing who people are, but by changing the authority around them, then the stability of self-concept is far more conditional than it appears. Because the most unsettling question is not why they obeyed. It is how easily the boundary between, "I would never do that," and "I did it anyway," can dissolve when authority becomes the voice that defines reality. What lingers beyond the procedure is not the machine, nor the switches, nor even the visible reactions of distress. What remains is a more unsettling realization about how identity behaves when placed under structured authority. The experiment demonstrated that obedience does not require the disappearance of morality. It requires its quiet suspension under conditions where responsibility is externally relocated. The individual does not stop being moral. Instead, moral judgment becomes displaced, rerouted through the authority system. This displacement creates a condition where actions and identity no longer align in real time. A person can believe they are good while simultaneously performing actions they would normally reject. The mind preserves self-image by attributing responsibility elsewhere. And this is where the deeper instability emerges. The same psychological mechanism that allows order and cooperation also allows moral contradiction under the right conditions. The implications extend beyond a single laboratory. They reveal a structural vulnerability in how self-concept interacts with authority, especially when authority is perceived as legitimate, technical, or necessary. Because once obedience becomes automated through legitimacy, the question is no longer whether people know right from wrong. The question becomes what happens when the system defining right is external, stable, and unquestioned. And if that mechanism is universal, then the boundary between moral intention and moral action is far more fragile than it appears. But the most disturbing implication is still not fully visible, because it suggests that under certain conditions, people may not only obey authority, they may begin to believe that obedience was their own decision all along. A quiet classroom in the early 1950s appears unremarkable at first glance. Wooden chairs, simple desks, a group of college students seated in a line, all facing forward. On the table, cards display vertical lines of different lengths. The task is intentionally simple. Identify which comparison line matches the standard line in length. Solomon Asch's experiment was designed to measure something that cannot be seen directly: how perception shifts under social pressure. Each participant sits among several others, believing they are all fellow subjects. In reality, only one person in each group is the true participant. The rest are actors, instructed to give incorrect answers at specific moments. First, the task feels obvious. The correct answers are visually clear. The participant answers confidently, trusting what they see. But then something subtle begins to change. The group responds before him. Their answers are unanimous but wrong. A line that is clearly shorter is repeatedly identified as matching the standard. The participant hesitates. For the first time, certainty becomes unstable. The tension is not in the image on the card. It is in the room. Silence after each incorrect group answer becomes heavier than the visual evidence in front of the participant. A conflict forms between what the eyes perceive and what the group affirms. And in that space, perception itself begins to lose authority. The experiment was not measuring intelligence. It was measuring what happens when the mind is forced to choose between reality and belonging. As the trials continue, the pattern becomes increasingly predictable. The group consistently provides the wrong answer on certain rounds. The participant begins to anticipate this distortion before it happens, not because perception changes, but because social certainty begins to weigh more than visual certainty. What emerges is a quiet psychological fracture. The participant sees one thing but hears another. And over repeated trials, the mind starts to negotiate between the two sources of truth. At first, disagreement feels possible. The participant may still choose the correct answer, even when it contradicts the group. But with each repetition, the cost of dissent becomes more noticeable. Not a physical cost, but a social one. Isolation, deviation, separation from consensus. The pressure is not explicit. No one threatens the participant. No one demands conformity. Yet the structure of unanimity itself becomes the force that reshapes decision-making. This is where Asch's findings become unsettling. A significant number of participants eventually conform at least once. Giving an answer they know is incorrect simply to align with the group. The critical shift is not in what they see, but in what they trust. The eyes remain functional. The perception remains intact. But confidence in personal judgment begins to weaken under collective certainty. What this reveals is not ignorance, but social recalibration. The mind does not fully abandon reality. It begins to share ownership of it with the group. And once that shift occurs, truth is no longer purely perceptual. It becomes negotiated. Asch's experiment reveals a mechanism that operates without force, without instruction, and without deception beyond the initial setup. The power lies in unanimity. When a group agrees on something that contradicts reality, the individual begins to question not only the answer, but the reliability of their own perception. This is not about ignorance or lack of intelligence. In controlled interviews after the experiment, many participants confirmed that they knew the group was wrong. Yet they still aligned at least once, describing discomfort that was difficult to articulate. A sense of standing apart, of becoming visibly different. What is being tested is not vision but social anchoring. The mind uses others as reference points to stabilize reality. When those reference points become unified but incorrect, internal certainty begins to erode. The most striking aspect is how quickly this erosion can occur. It does not require prolonged exposure. A few repeated instances are enough to create doubt where there was none before. And that doubt does not remain isolated to the task. It begins to extend inward, affecting confidence in judgment itself. What starts as a simple comparison of lines becomes something deeper. A demonstration of how fragile independent perception can be when confronted with unanimous contradiction. Because once the group defines what is obvious, the individual must decide whether seeing clearly is worth standing alone. What remains most unsettling is not that people occasionally conform, but how naturally the mind can reinterpret perception to preserve belonging. In Asch's findings, conformity was not constant, but it was significant enough to reveal a structural vulnerability in social cognition. The experiment suggests that perception is not purely private. It is continuously calibrated against the perceived certainty of others. When that calibration becomes misaligned with reality, internal doubt can override direct sensory evidence. This creates a quiet instability in everyday life. Most situations do not involve lines on cards, but they do involve ambiguity, group consensus, and the pressure of agreement. The same mechanism that operated in the laboratory does not disappear outside of it. What makes this phenomenon powerful is its subtlety. There is no moment of collapse, no dramatic break. Only incremental adjustments in what feels obvious, what feels reasonable, what feels safe to say. Over time, these adjustments shape not only answers but identity. The individual begins to trust collective interpretation as a safeguard against isolation. And this is where the deeper tension emerges. If perception can be reshaped by the presence of unanimity, then the boundary between what is seen and what is socially accepted becomes dangerously thin. Because the most difficult truth is not that people can be influenced. It is that under the right conditions, certainty itself can be rewritten without the person ever noticing when it stopped being their own. A different laboratory setting at Stanford University presents an almost absurd simplicity. The task given to participants is intentionally dull, repetitive, and meaningless. Turn pegs, fill spools, complete mechanical actions with no apparent purpose beyond endurance. The study, conducted by Leon Festinger and James Carl Smith in 1959, is not interested in the task itself. It is interested in what happens after the task ends, when participants are asked to speak to another person about their experience. At a certain point, each participant is asked to tell a waiting individual that the experiment was enjoyable, engaging, and interesting. The truth is the opposite. The task is boring, exhausting, and deliberately uninspiring. But the instruction is clear: present it positively. Some participants are offered a small payment for this lie, $1. Others are offered a larger payment, $20. Both groups perform the same act. They misrepresent their experience to another person. At first glance, this seems trivial. A simple social lie, a harmless adjustment for compensation. But what happens afterward reveals something far less intuitive. When later asked about their own experience of the task, the group paid only $1 begins to shift their internal evaluation. They start describing the task as more enjoyable than it objectively was. The group paid $20 does not show the same shift. Their internal judgment remains stable. The difference is not in the task. It is in the justification. With insufficient external reward, the mind is forced to resolve a contradiction. I said something untrue, and I received almost nothing for it. Therefore, I must have had a reason beyond money. And that reason becomes internal reinterpretation. The mind does not tolerate inconsistency. It repairs it. The most revealing moment in the study occurs after the behavior has already been completed. Nothing changes in the task itself. What changes is the mind's need to reconcile what has already been done with the sense of self that must remain intact. For those paid $1, the external justification is too weak to fully account for their action. They cannot comfortably say, "I did it for the money," because the reward feels insufficient to justify the dishonesty. This creates a psychological gap. To close that gap, the mind adjusts something more flexible than behavior, belief. The task is reinterpreted. What was dull becomes somewhat interesting. What was tedious becomes not so bad. The memory is subtly reshaped not because the experience changed, but because self-consistency demands resolution. In contrast, those paid $20 have a clear external explanation. The money is enough to justify the lie. There is no need to alter internal perception. The inconsistency is resolved externally, not internally. This is cognitive dissonance in action. The discomfort of holding two conflicting realities: I acted against my belief, and I am still a rational, consistent person. When external justification is insufficient, internal belief adapts. What emerges is a silent mechanism of self-protection. The mind would rather rewrite interpretation than maintain contradiction. And this rewriting is not conscious deception. It feels like genuine reflection. The new belief feels real because it is constructed to preserve identity continuity. The implication is unsettling. Memory and meaning are not fixed records. They are active repairs of internal conflict. What makes this mechanism so powerful is that it operates after the fact, when behavior can no longer be changed. Once an action is completed, the only available space for adjustment is interpretation. In everyday life, this means that decisions are rarely left psychologically unresolved. The mind does not simply store contradictions. It resolves them by reshaping meaning. A small justification becomes a large internal narrative. A minor inconsistency becomes a revised belief. Over time, these micro-adjustments accumulate into a coherent sense of self that feels stable, even if it is continuously being edited. The experiment demonstrates that belief is not always the origin of behavior. Sometimes it is the consequence of behavior that cannot be easily justified. And this reverses a common assumption. People do not always act according to what they believe. Often, they believe according to what they have already done. This creates a fragile loop between action and identity. Once behavior occurs, identity begins to adapt to preserve continuity. The self does not remain fixed while actions change around it. It reorganizes itself to make past actions feel consistent with present identity. The discomfort that triggers this process is invisible, but its outcome is persistent. A rewritten internal narrative that removes contradiction at the cost of altering truth. And this raises a deeper question that remains unresolved. If the mind can reliably change what it believes after acting, then how many of its truths are actually post-rationalizations of choices already made without awareness of why they were made at all? What remains after the study is not the task, nor the payment, nor even the act of lying itself. What remains is the recognition that the mind does not tolerate internal contradiction as a permanent state. It resolves it, sometimes through justification, sometimes through reinterpretation, sometimes through subtle rewriting of memory that feels indistinguishable from truth. This means that identity is not only expressed through action. It is also reconstructed after action in order to maintain coherence. The self is not a static observer of behavior. It is an active editor of meaning. The unsettling implication is that consistency is often achieved not by living without contradiction, but by continuously repairing it until it is no longer visible. And once that process is understood, the boundary between belief and justification begins to blur. What feels like conviction may sometimes be the final shape of an earlier compromise. But there is a deeper layer still unresolved, because if the mind can reliably rewrite its own interpretation to preserve coherence, then the question is no longer just how beliefs form. It becomes whether any belief survives unchanged after the mind has had enough time alone with its own contradictions. A theological seminary at Princeton provides the setting for a study that appears, at first, entirely unrelated to psychology. Students preparing for ministry are asked to participate in a communication exercise. The subject is the parable of the Good Samaritan, a moral narrative centered on compassion toward a stranger in distress. Each participant is instructed to move between buildings on campus to deliver a short talk. The content is simple, even familiar, but what matters is not the message, it is the journey. Before leaving, each student is given a different level of urgency. Some are told they have plenty of time. Others are told they are slightly late. And a third group is told something far more pressing. They are already late and must hurry immediately. Along the path between buildings, a staged scenario is placed deliberately in their way. A person is slumped in a doorway, appearing to be in visible distress. Coughing, struggling to remain upright, clearly in need of help. What makes the design of the experiment powerful is its simplicity. There is no ambiguity about what compassion would look like. The situation is immediate, human, and recognizable. Yet as each seminary student approaches the figure, something unexpected becomes visible. Hesitation is not determined by moral training, but by time pressure. Those with low urgency often stop. They ask questions, offer help, or attempt to assist. Those with high urgency frequently do not. They glance, register the situation, and continue walking. The moral identity is the same across all participants. The difference is not belief, it is speed. The results of the study reveal something uncomfortable about moral intention. These were individuals explicitly trained in ethical reflection, people whose identity was built around care, service, and compassion. Yet their behavior shifted dramatically under a simple situational constraint. What changed was not what they believed, but what the environment made psychologically available. When urgency increases, attention narrows. The mind reorganizes priorities around immediate constraints. In that narrowing, moral perception does not disappear, but it loses influence over action. This creates a silent displacement. The suffering of another person does not vanish, but it is processed differently. It becomes secondary to the perceived requirement of time. The ethical intention remains intact in abstraction, but fails in execution. The experiment demonstrates that moral identity is not always the dominant force in behavior. It competes with situational structure, and in many cases, structure wins without confrontation. No explicit instruction is given to ignore the person in need. No permission is granted to pass by. Yet many do so anyway, not because they reject compassion, but because their cognitive field has been compressed by urgency. What emerges is a gap between intention and action that is not rooted in morality itself, but in context. The same person who would stop under different conditions becomes someone who continues walking when pressure is introduced. And this reveals a fragile truth. Moral behavior is not only a question of values, but of environmental bandwidth. What makes this experiment particularly revealing is the absence of explicit moral failure. No participant is instructed to abandon ethics. No one declares that helping is unnecessary. The decision to pass by occurs quietly, almost automatically, under the weight of situational constraint. This suggests that moral action is not only dependent on internal values, but on the availability of cognitive space to enact them. When that space is occupied by urgency, the translation from belief to behavior breaks down. The implications extend beyond a single campus or a single scenario. They point to a broader pattern. Values that feel stable in reflection may become fragile in motion, especially when environmental pressure shifts attention away from them. The seminary students in the study did not lose their moral identity. They experienced it as intact. But behavior does not always require identity to collapse, only attention to be redirected. And this creates a subtle but powerful contradiction. People often assume that ethical failure comes from lack of care. The experiment suggests something different, can come from overload. In that state, the mind does not reject morality, postpones it. And postponement, under real-world conditions, often becomes indistinguishable from absence. What remains unresolved is not whether people know what is right, but how easily knowing can be separated from doing when time becomes the governing force of perception. The most disturbing implication of the Good Samaritan experiment is not that people sometimes fail to help. It is how easily failure can emerge without any change in belief. The participants still understood compassion. They still valued it. They still identified with it. Yet, under specific conditions, that identity did not translate into behavior. This reveals a structural vulnerability in moral systems. Values are not self-executing. They require conditions that allow them to surface in action. When those conditions are disrupted by time pressure, distraction, or competing demands, the link between intention and behavior weakens. And in that weakening, the mind does not register moral collapse. It registers urgency. It registers necessity. It registers, I cannot stop right now. The suffering of another person remains real, but it becomes cognitively secondary. Not denied, not rejected, but displaced. What emerges is a pattern that extends far beyond the laboratory setting. The same ethical identity can produce radically different behavior depending on environmental structure alone. And this leads to a question that is difficult to resolve cleanly. If moral action depends so heavily on context, then how much of what is called character is actually just stability of environment disguised as stability of self? Because the most uncomfortable truth is not that people fail to act morally. It is that, under the right pressure, even the intention to act morally can become irrelevant in the moment it is most needed, and the mind will not experience it as failure but as necessity. Inside a neuroscience laboratory in London, A group of taxi drivers sits quietly while researchers scan their brains. The setting is clinical, almost indifferent in its precision. White walls, controlled lighting, machines designed to translate lived experience into measurable structure. The study, led by Eleanor Maguire and her team at University College London around the year 2000, focuses on something deceptively simple: navigation. London's taxi drivers are required to master the knowledge, an extensive mental map of thousands of streets, routes, and landmarks. It is not memorization in the usual sense. It is spatial survival in motion. What the researchers discover is not visible on the surface of behavior, but deep within the brain itself. The hippocampus, a region associated with spatial memory and navigation, shows measurable structural differences in experienced taxi drivers compared to non-drivers. The longer the career, the more pronounced the change. Years spent navigating the dense, unpredictable structure of London do not only refine skill, they physically reshape neural architecture. This is not metaphor. It is anatomy. The mind is not merely using the environment. It is being sculpted by it. For these drivers, identity is not just a set of thoughts or routines. It is embedded in constant spatial problem-solving, in continuous recalibration of direction, distance, and route selection under pressure. What begins as a profession becomes a cognitive environment that reorganizes how space itself is represented internally. And in that transformation, something fundamental becomes visible. Experience is not stored passively. It is written into structure. As the imaging data accumulates, a pattern becomes unmistakable. The brains of experienced London taxi drivers show a distinct enlargement in the posterior hippocampus compared to control subjects. This difference correlates with years of navigating complex urban environments. The implication is subtle but profound. Repeated interaction with a demanding environment does not just refine cognitive skill. It reorganizes the physical substrate that supports that skill. In other words, the city is not only being navigated, it is being internalized. Each route learned, each shortcut memorized, each spatial decision made under real-world constraints contributes to a gradual restructuring of neural pathways. Over time, the brain adapts to the demands placed on it, optimizing itself for the kind of thinking that environment requires. What makes this finding significant is not only the structural change, but what it implies about identity. Professional identity in this context is not abstract. It is materially embedded in brain structure shaped by repetition, pressure, and spatial complexity. The taxi driver is not simply someone who knows the city. The taxi driver becomes a brain that has been adapted by the city. This shifts the understanding of learning away from accumulation and toward transformation. Experience is not added on top of a stable system. It alters the system itself. And once that is understood, the boundary between environment and self begins to dissolve. What emerges from this research is a fundamental reversal of intuition. Identity is often assumed to be something internal and stable, with environment acting as a backdrop. But the evidence suggests a more dynamic relationship. The environment is not passive. It is instructive. It trains the brain not only in what to do, but in how to be organized. For London taxi drivers, the cognitive demands of navigation do not remain external challenges. They become internal architecture. Spatial reasoning is not just practiced, it becomes structurally reinforced. This means that professional identity is not merely a label applied to behavior. It is a long-term adaptation process that physically differentiates the brain according to environmental demands. And importantly, this change is not symbolic. It is measurable, observable, and cumulative. The longer the exposure to a structured environment, the more deeply that structure is reflected in neural organization. This introduces a quiet but powerful implication. What is experienced daily does not simply influence thought. It reshapes the organ that produces thought. And if the brain is continuously adapting to its environment in this way, then identity cannot be separated cleanly from context. It becomes a living record of sustained interaction between structure and experience. The most unsettling aspect of the taxi driver studies is not the change itself, but its implication for continuity of self. If repeated environmental demands can reshape brain structure over time, then stability of identity becomes conditional rather than fixed. The brain does not remain identical across prolonged exposure to different cognitive environments. It reorganizes according to necessity, efficiency, and repetition. What is reinforced becomes stronger. What is unused becomes less dominant. In the case of London taxi drivers, navigation is not a temporary skill. It becomes a defining cognitive framework that leaves measurable traces in brain anatomy. This suggests that identity is not preserved in spite of experience, but through it. Every environment lived in leaves a structural imprint, whether subtle or profound. And this leads to a deeper realization. There is no purely static version of the self operating independently of context. There is only the current configuration shaped by accumulated environments. The implication is not metaphorical. It is biological. Identity, in part, is a record of adaptation written into neural structure. And if that is true, then every sustained environment is quietly participating in the construction of who a person becomes, even when no conscious intention is involved. But the most difficult question remains. If the brain is always being reshaped by its environment, then what part of the self is ever truly independent of what surrounds it? In a controlled research facility during the final years of the Second World War, a group of volunteers enters an experiment designed to study something far beyond simple nutrition. The setting, led by Anselkes between 1944 and 1945, is known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. The participants are physically healthy young men, selected for their stability and baseline condition. At first, the environment is structured, almost clinical in its precision. Meals are regulated. Movement is monitored. Daily routines are predictable. But the core of the experiment begins when caloric intake is deliberately reduced to semi-starvation levels. What follows is not only physical decline, but a progressive transformation of psychological state. At first, hunger is a sensation. Then it becomes an orientation point. Then it becomes the dominant structure organizing thought. Participants begin to report an obsessive preoccupation with food. Conversations shift. Reading material loses relevance unless it involves eating. Fantasies about meals become vivid, repetitive, and intrusive. As deprivation continues, personality changes emerge. Irritability increases. Emotional regulation weakens. Social withdrawal becomes more frequent. The mind, once flexible and externally oriented, narrows into a single axis of survival. The experiment reveals something unsettling. Identity is not insulated from physiology. When the body is pushed into sustained deficit, the structure of thought itself begins to reorganize around lack. What was once a stable sense of self becomes increasingly unstable under the pressure of biological need. As weeks progress in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, the changes deepen beyond food obsession. What begins as cognitive narrowing evolves into a restructuring of emotional life. Participants report loss of interest in previously meaningful activities. Social interactions become strained. Humor diminishes or takes on a darker tone. Concentration becomes difficult unless related to food or eating. The body's deprivation does not remain confined to physical sensation. It reorganizes mental priorities at every level. The hierarchy of needs becomes visible in behavior with increasing clarity. Survival overrides identity expression. One of the most striking observations is how perception itself changes. Portions of food appear larger in imagination. Cooking, serving, and even reading about meals takes on exaggerated significance. The mind amplifies food-related stimuli while filtering out unrelated information. This narrowing is not voluntary. It is adaptive. The brain recalibrates attention toward what is biologically essential under conditions of scarcity. But in doing so, it destabilizes the broader structure of personality. Traits that once seemed stable, patience, sociability, optimism, become inconsistent or fragmentary. Emotional responses become less predictable. Small frustrations escalate. Motivation for long-term goals declines sharply. The present moment dominates mental life almost entirely. The experiment demonstrates that what is often described as personality is partially dependent on physiological stability. When that stability is removed, the architecture of behavior begins to shift. Identity under sustained deprivation does not remain intact. Contracts. As deprivation continues, the Minnesota starvation experiment reveals a critical threshold where physiological need begins to dominate not only thought, but identity expression itself. Participants experience a narrowing of interests so profound that food becomes the central organizing principle of mental life. Planning, imagination, and even ethical reflection become subordinated to immediate bodily demand. The researchers observe that this is not simply hunger in a passive sense. It is an active restructuring of cognition. The mind reorganizes itself around scarcity as if recalibrating its entire operating system. Even emotional sensitivity is altered. Reactions become disproportionate or blunted depending on context, but always filtered through the lens of deprivation. What emerges is a condition in which the self is no longer experienced as a broad, stable identity, but as a survival-focused mechanism operating under constraint. The experiment highlights a crucial distinction. Identity is not only shaped by memory or belief, but also by the current state of the body that supports it. When the body is deprived, the mind does not remain unaffected. It adapts, and in adapting, it changes what the self is capable of being in that moment. This creates a form of erosion that is not dramatic but gradual. Not destruction in a single moment, but reorganization over time until previous versions of personality become difficult to access. And in that shift, something fundamental becomes visible. Stability of identity depends on conditions that are often invisible until they are removed. By the later stages of the Minnesota starvation experiment, the boundary between physical need and psychological identity becomes increasingly indistinct. Participants no longer simply think about food. Their cognitive world reorganizes around it in ways that affect attention, emotion, and even self-perception. The deprivation does not only reduce energy, it reshapes the architecture of desire. What is most striking is how quickly previously stable traits can dissolve under sustained physiological stress. Characteristics that defined personality at the start of the experiment become less reliable as indicators of behavior. The self becomes less anchored in long-term narrative and more anchored in immediate bodily state. Future planning diminishes. Abstract thinking weakens. The present dominates. Yet even within this collapse, there is coherence. The mind is not chaotic. It is precisely reorganized around survival efficiency. This suggests that identity is not simply lost under deprivation. It is reconfigured into a different mode of operation, one optimized for scarcity rather than stability. The experiment forces a difficult realization. What is considered normal personality may depend heavily on conditions that are rarely acknowledged when those conditions are intact. When those conditions change, the self does not remain the same observer of experience. It becomes something narrower, more urgent, and fundamentally altered in structure. And the most unsettling implication remains unresolved. If basic physiological states can so profoundly reshape identity, then how much of what feels like who I am is actually dependent on conditions that can disappear without warning? In the early 1970s, after the Vietnam War, researchers began following a group of American soldiers returning home. What they had observed in Vietnam was alarming. A significant number of servicemen had used heroin in a combat environment where the drug was widely available and easily accessible. The expectation, based on prevailing assumptions about addiction at the time, was clear. Continued use after return would be highly likely. Addiction was understood primarily as a stable, persistent condition rooted in the individual. But the longitudinal findings reported by Lee Robbins and colleagues in 1974 challenged that assumption in a striking way. Many of the soldiers who had developed heroin use patterns in Vietnam did not continue using the drug after returning to the United States. A substantial proportion simply stopped. What changed was not the substance. It was the environment. In Vietnam, heroin use existed within a specific structural context. Constant stress, immediate availability, social normalization among peers, and the psychological conditions of war. The drug was embedded in a survival landscape. Back home, those structural conditions disappeared. The behavior that had appeared stable under one set of conditions did not persist when the context shifted. The identity associated with use, whether as coping, adaptation, or routine, lost its environmental reinforcement. What the study revealed was not a simple case of breaking addiction, but something more fundamental. Behavior that appears deeply rooted can dissolve when the surrounding system that sustains it is removed. The significance of the Vietnam veteran study lies in what it implies about the relationship between behavior and identity. Addiction, in this context, does not appear as a fixed internal property that remains constant across environments. Instead, it shows sensitivity to external structure, availability, stress, social norms, and daily routines. In Vietnam, heroin use was not isolated from context. It was embedded within a system where extreme conditions made certain coping behaviors more likely and more sustained. The drug became part of an adaptive response to an overwhelming environment. Upon return, that adaptive context was removed. The pressures changed. The cues disappeared. The social and environmental reinforcement that had supported the behavior no longer existed. As a result, many individuals did not simply fight addiction in a psychological sense. The behavior lost its ecological support. This does not reduce the seriousness of addiction. Instead, it reframes it. It suggests that what appears to be purely internal struggle is often tightly coupled with external conditions that sustain it. Identity-linked behaviors are not always stable across environments. They can be highly contingent on context, even when they feel subjectively permanent. The study therefore challenges a simple model of self-containment. Behavior is not only generated from within. It is continuously shaped, maintained, and sometimes dissolved by external structure. What makes the Vietnam veterans' findings particularly powerful is the reversal they introduce into how persistence is understood. Behavior that appears deeply ingrained can, under the right conditions, fade without direct intervention focused on the behavior itself. The absence of reinforcing context becomes sufficient for change. This does not imply that addiction is simple or that environment alone determines outcomes. Rather, it highlights a coupling between internal states and external systems that is often underestimated. In Vietnam, heroin use functioned within a highly specific adaptive landscape. In the United States, that landscape was replaced by a different set of demands, cues, and constraints. The behavioral pattern did not transfer with equal strength. The shift reveals that what is often labeled as identity may sometimes be a reflection of sustained environmental reinforcement rather than a fixed internal structure. When reinforcement disappears, the behavior can weaken dramatically, even if it once appeared central to the person's functioning. This creates a discontinuity in how stability of self is usually assumed. What feels permanent may, in reality, depend on ongoing contextual support. The implication is not that identity is illusory, but that it is dynamic, responsive to systems that either sustain or withdraw support for certain patterns of behavior. And once that is understood, the question shifts from why people change to what conditions were silently maintaining stability in the first place. Across all phases of the Vietnam veteran study, the central insight remains consistent. Behavior that appears deeply rooted in identity can be highly sensitive to context. The return from Vietnam did not erase experience. It altered the conditions under which that experience expressed itself behaviorally. This distinction is crucial. The individuals did not become entirely different people. Rather, the environmental scaffolding that supported certain patterns of behavior was no longer present. What had been sustained by repetition, stress, availability, and social normalization in one setting became unnecessary or unsupported in another. This suggests that stability of behavior is not solely a function of internal resolve, but also of external reinforcement structures that may be invisible when intact. When those structures are removed, behaviors that once seemed defining can diminish rapidly, revealing how dependent they were on their environment. The implication extends beyond addiction. It touches any pattern of identity-linked behavior that appears stable over time, and it raises a final, unresolved tension. If the context can so profoundly determine whether a behavior persists or disappears, then what remains of identity when every reinforcing environment is stripped away and nothing external is left to hold it in place? There is a point where effort stops being the engine of change and environment takes over completely. Not in a dramatic way, not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet takeover that happens through repetition, context, and survival pressure. Identity does not resist this process as much as it is reorganized by it. People often imagine the self as something that stands above circumstance, observing it, choosing within it. But real behavioral data across different human conditions suggests something less stable. The self is continuously negotiated by what surrounds it. Even the strongest intentions are filtered through available cues. What is accessible, what is rewarded, what is punished, what is repeated, these variables slowly rewrite what feels natural. This is why change rarely fails in a single moment. It fails in environments that quietly reassert older patterns without needing permission. The mind does not simply decide what to become. It adapts to what it is repeatedly allowed to become. And in that adaptation, identity feels continuous from the inside, even while it is shifting from the outside. There is no instant transformation into a different self. There is only gradual replacement of what the environment supports and what it stops supporting. What remains consistent is not who someone is, but the system that is currently shaping what that person can sustain without resistance. The illusion of control often survives because change feels like a personal event, a decision, turning point, a moment of clarity. But most transformations are not located in moments. They are distributed across time, reinforced or weakened by environments that rarely announce their influence. This creates a mismatch between experience and causation. People feel they are the authors of their stability or their collapse, while the underlying structure is often shared between repetition and context. What is labeled as discipline or failure is frequently the visible surface of a deeper alignment or misalignment with surroundings. When the environment supports a behavior, it becomes effortless. When it does not, even strong motivation begins to erode under friction. This is not about diminishing agency. It is about exposing how agency operates inside constraints that are rarely seen as active forces. Every environment quietly selects what is easy to continue and what becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Over time, the self adjusts not through sudden decisions, but through continuous accommodation to what persists around it. And the most difficult realization is that consistency is often not a trait of character, but a reflection of stability in conditions. Where conditions shift, identity does not remain untouched. It recalibrates even when awareness lags behind the change. There is a deeper discomfort that appears when identity is no longer treated as a fixed center, but as a moving outcome of conditions. It becomes difficult to locate a single origin point for behavior. Every action is partially inherited from context, partially from history, and partially from the present structure of surroundings. This removes the simplicity of a stable self acting on a neutral world. Instead, there is continuous interaction between internal states and external pressures, each shaping the other without clear separation. Even the feeling of being unchanged can be misleading. Stability is often just slow adaptation that has reached equilibrium with its environment. And when that environment shifts, what seemed permanent begins to reveal its dependency. Nothing about this process is dramatic in isolation. It becomes visible only when enough time passes to compare different states of the same person under different conditions. What emerges is not collapse, but reconfiguration. Not loss of identity, but transformation of its operating structure. And once that structure is seen clearly, the idea of a fully independent self becomes difficult to maintain without questioning what it depends on. The final tension is not between change and stability, but between perception and structure. From the inside, continuity feels absolute. The sense of being the same observer persists even as everything observable about behavior shifts under different conditions. This creates a powerful illusion that identity is something carried intact through time. But structure tells a different story. It shows adaptation layered upon adaptation, each one responsive to what was necessary at the moment it formed. There is no single version of the self that exists outside of these layers. Only the current configuration, shaped by what has been reinforced, removed, or transformed. And yet, the mind experiences this configuration as unity. That gap between experience and structure is where most misunderstandings about identity originate. It is also where the illusion of permanence survives. because what feels like me is not outside the system of influence. It is the product of it, stabilized only as long as the conditions that shaped it remain in place. When those conditions change, the feeling of continuity does not guarantee continuity of structure. Only one truth remains beneath all interpretations. The self is not something that resists its environment from the outside, but something that is continuously formed by it from within.